So a very big welcome to the flaming threads of fashion, from local mills to global markets. I'm Sheila, I'm part of the New Mills Fashion Week team, and we've come together this evening with Transition New Mills to explore some of the local history of textile production in New Mills, and a lot more broadly than that. Also, to take a look at issues around sustainability in today's fashion industry. So quite a broad remit, really. A particularly warm welcome to our two speakers, Jill Hulme and Patsy Perry. And we hope you're going to have an enjoyable evening and find it interesting and maybe inspiring as well. Tonight actually follows on from an event that we held last October. I think it's possible that some of you who've come this evening also came to that event. It was called the New Mills Fashion Week, and it covered 5 Zoom meetings exploring clothes and fast fashion. We looked at a number of different themes, including a little bit about the history of fashion, and also how fashion influences how we feel about ourselves as women. And we spent some time looking at various issues around cheap labour and the exploitation of garment makers around the world as part of the week as well. We also touched on the environmental impact of the fashion industry, including things like the carbon footprint, and also the problems that arise around waste disposal. We also looked at how we could do something ourselves to cut down on consumer waste, things like looking after our own clothes so that they would last longer, and recycling clothes as well. And at the end, we had a real fun fashion show, which included a lot of photographs and presentations of things that people had made, that people had bought in charity shops, or that were really much loved garments that people would never dream of throwing away after, well, in my case, 40 years of owning something. So it was really interesting, and I think everybody enjoyed that very much. And we managed to raise, through donations in New Mills Fashion Week, £500 for Testimony Tailors, which is a sewing cooperative run by Rohingya refugee women in Bangladesh. So we were very, very heartened by that. We've chosen today, the 22nd of April, for this event because it's the 8th anniversary of the Rana Plaza disaster in Bangladesh. And you may already know that that involved the collapse of an illegally constructed building in Dhaka, which housed, among other things, 5 garment factories. And in that disaster, over 1,100 people were killed and 2,500 were injured. That disaster, and unfortunately and sadly many others like it, has highlighted the conditions, the low wages, and the exploitation of textile workers around the world. Somebody referred to these conditions as being like slave labour at the time of that disaster in 2013. 22nd of April is also Earth Day, which began in the US in 1970 to mobilise people around environmental issues. And Earth Day is now a global event involving lots of different kinds of action in many countries, not just today. And this year's theme for Earth Day is Restore Our Earth, which is focusing on the restoration of ecosystems. So that's the background to this evening, and our two speakers, Jill and Patsy, are each going to have 30 minutes about 15 or 20 minutes for their talk, and then another 10 minutes for any questions that you might like to put to them. And if you have any questions, please would you post those in the chat box so that we can see them for those 10 minutes after their talk. And if you'd like to stay with us after the end of the second talk, we should have more time for further questions. So, you know, keep putting questions in the chat box if you would like to do so, and we will try our best to address as many as we can before we finish at 9:30. So, without more ado, I'd very much like, first of all, to introduce Jill Hulme, who is our local New Mills historian. And she's going to talk about the fantastic follies of fashion, the making of New Mills and its people. So over to you, Jill. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sheila. Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. I've broken the internet, so thank you very much, Penny, for doing my slides for me. Here we go. This is a 5-year course, and we're going to do it in 15 minutes. I want to draw us from the what happened in Rana Plaza. What is the link between a place near Dhaka with New Mills? I'm talking to people, I assume you know your way around New Mills, so forgive me if I've made a mistake on that. And I'm also talking as if you kind of don't know very much at all about textile history, so forgive me if I've made a mistake on that as well. And the link is between Rana Plaza and New Mills is our more than 200 years of history as a textile town here. And the link is with India. And recall that India has only recently been separated off from Bangladesh and Pakistan. So it's the whole of historic India. Well, I'm going to say historic India, Mughal India. Slide 2, please. The link is, I called it the fantastical folly of fashion. I stole that lovely expression from a real historian of textiles. And it is fashion that is actually central to where this story begins, how we get from Dhaka to New Mills and back again to Dhaka. Next slide, please. Back to Hogarth. I'm sure you all recognize this picture. Isn't she lovely? I want you to look at this one. I hope you can see it reasonably clearly. But here she is, a lady of the town, painted in 1733. And what I want to draw your attention to is look at her gorgeous colored stockings, knitted from very fine fibers. If they're not silk, they may well be cotton. Highly colored, highly patterned. Look at her white muslin chemise, which is falling off her shoulders. Look at her printed gown. The print of her gown isn't terribly clear, but I like this picture so much that we've got it. But what she's got is designed, printed onto the fabric. What was going on in the late 1600s and the early 1700s that this sort of thing was possible? The new fashionable cotton fabrics were beginning to arrive from India in the 15 and 1600s, and the massive handcraft industry that was creating exquisite cotton textiles, variety of styles, designs, and qualities, was centuries old in India, to be massively promoted by the Mughal Empire. But by the time we get to our lovely lady here, it's starting to come into Europe, and the trading nations of Northern Europe, the English, Dutch, Portuguese, were going mad for these textiles. Can I have the next slide, please? The thing that India was doing back in the centuries ago was producing cotton textiles of the most dazzling colours. You can't do this with linen, and you can't do this with wool, which was all we've got in our part of the world. But cotton takes up colour, and it was dazzling. It was desirable, and in the era of, in the 1700s, the rise of an ever more of a consumer society, a global consumer society, the Indian hand textile makers were satisfying very, very successfully. They worked to the market. Can I have the next? Look at that. I mean, wouldn't you just die for that? These were probably hand painted. But the Indian market was creating new textiles for the Europeans as they were getting more and more excited about what could be had. And it was fashion that was leading the way for the home industry, so for the British market, for the European market, but also for re-export all around the globe. So if we can just look at the next few, number 5, the next slide, please. I mean, wouldn't you just cry for that? This was specifically for the European market, a very, very pale background, and then beautifully coloured and elaborate designs. This would not have been worn in India or would not have been traded around the Indian Ocean. This was specifically for the marketplace in Europe and on to the Americas, for example. And the next one, please. Look at that. That's handmade muslin from India, from Bengal, which was the centre of the muslin trade. And this is actually, can't see it on here, but it is hand embroidered as well. And this was being created for the market to be bought up by the European traders. And the English were very, very keen. The next one, please. Well, I had to have them in, didn't I? Here's the Bennett Sisters with their sprigged muslins. This kind of material was a growing, a desirable, consumable, to show that you were fashionable. This is what you needed to show. For the fabulously wealthy, they might be able to have any manner of them. But for the people of modest means, they would try to get their hands on, even if it were just a handkerchief or a piece of material, because it was so desirable. And fashion keeps coming to signify what happens with this trade. The thing that I find quite interesting is that the woolen industry in this country, sorry, this is a diversion, but I love it, lobbied government to prevent the importing of these wonderful Indian textiles. It was protectionist. And so people smuggled and they got around it and they found loopholes. They were David Camerons. They found a way around it. It stimulated the quest to actually manufacture the textiles themselves in this country. If you can't import, can we import them? No. Well, can we import the thread? Oh, all right, you can import the thread. Can we import the printed cloth? No, you can't. Well, can we import the white cloth? Well, yes, you can import the white cloth. Well, then we can import the white cloth and we can print it. And there were ways around actually faffing about with what was prohibited or what was very, very highly taxed to make it into something then that could go back onto the marketplace and be traded around the world. And so they did. Can I have the next slide, please? This is how, you've probably seen this sort of thing. This is how textiles had been produced in this country, obviously for centuries. It largely was domestic production, a family affair, where we have in the middle, we have a child working. What I want you to remember, if nothing else, is all children worked. The factory system did not create child labour. Children worked. And here is a child doing some preparatory work in a household where on the left-hand side, the women are doing the spinning, and on the right-hand side, the man is doing the weaving. And so the household was the economic unit, and everybody has to keep to it to get to earn some money, particularly places around here where agriculture was so unproductive that you'd have to have something else to keep you going. And textiles was ubiquitous. Wool was obviously long practiced, but when cotton, raw cotton, starts to come in, it then goes into this domestic cottage system and is reasonably successful. What the dealers and the manufacturers are trying to do is to imitate the Indian products and see if they can cash in. Can I have the next slide, please? The drive to increase production, to meet the market, it's driven by the markets. The drive to increase production leads eventually, over decades of faffing about, to this, the first ever truly successful mechanized cotton spinning machine in the world. There's only one left in the world. Don't let me talk about it because I'll cry. This machine could raise production. Instead of 4 women sitting there spinning, you've now got about 100 spindles going at once. And the error, it's not an error, but the thing I don't like about it is this machine was built in order to be tended by children, by women and children. In these operations, there were very, very few men. Adult male labor was in charge and did quite a few activities, but mostly the faffing about, the running backwards and forwards, the changing all those bobbins was to be done by children. And the incentives there were to raise production by mechanization. This is a water frame. I'm sure some of you do recognize it at Helmshire Museum. And the trick was to get it water powered, from human power to water power. And women and children, as far as possible, were going to do all that work. And this brings us home. This brings us to new mills. The people around here who were working in the domestic industries, household industries, had the opportunity to find a way. Can we get one of these mills up by our rivers, because we're not short of water, and have one of these? This is an Arkwright. I'm sure people know this is one of Arkwright's patents. Let's get going. Let's crack on. Let's cash in on this huge growing market for cotton. And if you go down to the Tors, there were, by the 1780s, 4 small water-powered textile mills with these kinds of machines in them. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So as soon as the Heritage Centre opens, rush in and go and look at the model of new mills. This is actually now 1880. There are, if you look at the river banks, there are, in fact, you can't always see them, but there were 4 water-powered cotton mills right around the Tors. Those are just the ones you can see. Water-powered production grows all along the riverbanks, right up, as you know, to Hayfield, and it goes down the river, linking up with Stockport, linking up, of course, with Manchester. And it works. I say it works, there's another diversion, but you know, for every one that works, 10 people go bankrupt. But these were the innovations of the day. They start going up in about the 1780s. And New Mills is founded around this industry. So there's industry, there are possibilities, there are places to work. The people who are being put out of work as hand spinners are the women and children. However, there's work for women and children in these new factories. Can I have the next slide, please? By the time we get to the end of the 1800s, we have got a heavily industrialized river. This is Watford Bridge print works. A little of the footprint remains. This is the late 1800s, judging by that chap's clothes. What were the hazards for the people who came to work, or for the people who were working in the textile industries? The most striking thing for me in this photograph is the chimney. And the smoke from the steam-powered mills, which replaced the water-powered mills, is polluting the air. There were about 20 works along the 4-mile stretch between Strines and Birch Vale, and along the canal in Newtown, which was a second generation of factories. And if you add to that smoke, the smoke from the railways and from the houses and from the engineering works that went alongside them, new mills had a filthy and a dangerous atmosphere. There was no effective measure to clean up the atmosphere. Tell me if I'm wrong, but as far as I know, the 1956 Clean Air Act was the first effective legislation to clean up the airs in our towns and cities. This was a printworks. Printworks actually become the dominant industry in new mills. Spinning and weaving do exist, but the printing and the dyeing and the bleaching is what we were really good at and specialised in it. And that's where the added value comes in. Bleach works and dye works and print works all along the rivers use vast amounts of water, and inevitably they also pollute the rivers. They do try to recycle the water, actually. There are filtration methods, but I think it was, if you talk to people who lived here a few decades ago, they can tell you that you really would not let your dog fall in the river because they were filthy. They were polluted with the effluents from these chemically rich industries. And during the 19th century, our rivers were completely toxic. And I'm quite pleased to say today that we know we've got fish in the rivers, there are bugs in the rivers, and actually my grandchildren have paddled in the river, but you wouldn't do that in the 1800s. Can I have the next picture, please, Penny? Thanks. This one is Bait Mill Bleach Works from about 1900 or so. Inside the works, these bleach workers were inhaling a toxic atmosphere because the industry had become heavily reliant on artificial chemicals, laden with toxic fumes of the bleach. The workers endured lung and eye irritation constantly. And I've got a name for a worker at Strines, Mary Nielsen. Somebody just mentions Mary Nielsen. I don't know anything else about her, but that she was ill from the effects of inhaling toxic aniline compounds, which were used for various parts of the bleaching and dyeing industry. So I don't know what happened to Mary Nielsen, but she worked in an industry that meant, you know, she fainted at work because of the lung disease that she was suffering from. Can I see the next picture, please, Penny? I'm sure many people are familiar with this. This is the next generation of spinning machines. These are called mules. And if you, never mind, I won't talk about that because I won't stop. But in the spinning and weaving rooms that people were working in, the atmosphere was filled with minute cotton fibres flying around. They were supposed to be ventilated, but it was pretty impossible, to be honest. And it was an occupational hazard. Lung disease was an occupational hazard of those who worked within the spinning and the weaving industries. This is of about 1835. This is a much more modern spinning machine, a mule. And the hazard of the machinery itself was often recorded. You will come across references to this all around the place. At this date, those moving parts, I can't really point them out to you, but this machine is moving. One side's going out and the other side's going in, and they take turns. The moving parts, the power shafts, the wheels were not fenced off. There was no requirement to fence them off until well into the 1840s. And people lost their fingers, people lost their scalps, people lost their limbs. If you look to the right of that picture, if you can see it okay, there is what you think you can see is a child underneath that sheet of threads, cleaning the floor and the parts of the machine before it closes. So it's open right now, it's whirring around, it's actually putting the twist on the cotton. Zzz, that kid cleans out the fluff. It's to recycle the waste, but it's also to keep the machinery clean so it doesn't bung up before it clunks back into place, as the one on the left already has done. I won't go on about the hazard of that child under there because it's self-evident. There is another name. James Potts was recorded as had recorded an accidental death in 1834. He was spinning in new mills, and so he will be the adult male in this picture, and he was caught in the machinery and he died. I don't know enough about particularly new mills incidents, but we know that these were the occupational hazards of people in mills. Look at the adult male worker in the middle of the picture. He's in charge. He might actually be employing his own family there. That was, again, the sort of a reconstitution of the family income by he who was the highly paid skilled worker. He's in charge. He's working at waist height to the machinery. And what was discovered only in the early 20th century was that the reason there was such a high incidence of cancer of the scrotum amongst male spinners was splashes of oil soaked his clothes and contaminated his skin. And it was a special hazard for the men and boys that worked in these spinning rooms. The only other comparator, apparently, is the children who worked up chimneys as chimney sweep boys, because the dust, the soot had the same effect, and cancer of the scrotum was their special hazard. Read Water Babies, read Hard Times, it's all in there. Can we have the next image? This was a weaver much later on now. As you can see, we're into the 20th century, and I rather think she's on a jacquard loom. But what I want you to look at is one of the hazards of the weaver. Look at her face. She's holding in her left hand a thread of cotton weft. And in order to rethread it into the shuttle, she's sucking it through the eye. So she gets hold of it like that and she goes, and it's ready to be popped into the machine. She does that about 300 times a day, depending on how many looms she's got. It was called kissing the shuttle. And they did it, rather than use the little hook that you could use, they did it by that mechanism because it was so quick. And every time you stop your loom, you're losing money. So you have to be as quick as you can. She's inhaling oil. She's inhaling cotton fibers. She's inhaling possibly tuberculosis from the last person that touched that shuttle. These were the special diseases of the weaving shed. In addition, as you probably know, the noise of the weaving shed, if you've ever been to a museum, you've seen them, was there was no protection against the noise, and it was not untypical for weavers to lose their hearing from having spent years and years in a weaving shed. Can I have the next one, Penny? Thank you. Here is the hazard of fire. This is Tor Mill in 1912. Cotton mills regularly saw fires break out. It was a highly combustible material, whirring machinery and sparks all the time. It was very, it was very likely that there'd be more than one fire on and off through your working life. The great, and mill people were used to it. Small fires would appear, they'd put them out. Small fires would appear, they'd put them out. It was a constant guard against fire. But if it took hold, it could go through the whole building in no time at all. And in New Mills, there's one, I've only come across one report of people having to be rescued from a burning mill, and unfortunately they were. The greatest hazard was not being caught in the fire. The greatest hazard was when that mill's burnt down, we're all out of work. It's possible as well that the employer's gone bust. Not all of them were insured properly, and we've no work, and we've no insurance against that. This is one of the huge hazards of being in the textile industry, was the insecurity of your work. There's a report for Tor Mill, the first time it burnt down in 1838. Reports in the newspaper, a relief fund was started.
Yes, thank you.
A relief fund was started to ease the poverty of the employees. That is to say, they relied upon self-help, they relied upon charity. 150 people at Brunswick Mill were thrown out of work in 1883. And what happens to them is nobody's responsibility in those days. Can I have the next one, please? Here's a printer. He's hand printing. It all looks very William Morris, but there's another side to it. This is how you get the beautiful patterns on. Before it's mechanized, it's done, but I call it potato printing, but that's because I know nothing at all. If you can look at the next image, cotton was a very volatile trade. Times are good, times are bad. When times are bad, workers would be put on short time. So these people would be sent home, or they'd only do half a week's work, and they'd have a half a week's income or no income. But by contrast, when trade was brisk, as they used to call it, we've got lots of orders, we've got to get them out, crack on, very, very long hours were expected. Here's a block printer. The guy's, he's actually highly paid, highly skilled, and he pays the kid who's his assistant, and he can't do anything without that assistant. So if he's working an 18-hour day, so's the kid. Their job was just to load colour onto the pad all day long. And at Strines, a routine day, we know, was 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. less your meal times. But in the good times, we know from reports of the 1842 inspection, people were working extra hours to fulfill those orders, the adults and the children alike. We know that Robert Wheeldon and his sister Ellen all worked up to 16 hours at a time. Little William Marsland worked up to 16 hours at a time. Alice Bennett started at age 7, and she sometimes had done a 24-hour shift, sleeping in her meal times to catch up. All children worked. I can't emphasize that enough. At home, on the land, down the mine, in the workshops, up chimneys. But textile mills become the shock question for reformers because they were visible. These children were now visible. They were the first industry to ever have any attempts at controlling the hours and the conditions of work, starting in 1702 with the first act, which was unenforceable. And it took about 100 years for childhood to be, if you like, invented in this country. I want to just point on another thing, though, that what happened, it was legislation that transformed the industry. It took generations, and by about 1900, young children of 7 were no longer were no longer out at work. There was employment, there were opportunities, and there was community. So I want to end on a light note. If I can have the next slide, Penny, please. This is the light note. If you just kind of see this mechanic shop, on the left-hand side, there's George Scott. He wrote his memoirs. He's a very, very interesting chap. And he began as one of those little printer's assistants, standing next to the printer, bored out of his head, falling asleep on his feet at Strines. And he complains mostly about the long hours and the boredom. But George progressed. He managed to get into the mechanic shop there at Strines Printworks, and he progressed to be very highly skilled, very responsible. He told his story, and what I was taken with him and a couple of other people whose stories I've read, is the immense pride they took in their work, because there were interesting opportunities like this engineering work that support the textile industry. Can I have the next one as well? I'm nearly done now. This is later on, obviously you can tell by the hair, this is the 1960s. This is Watford Bridge Printworks in the 1960s. They're still printing there. And here is a room full of artists at work, creating the designs for the cotton textiles at Watford Bridge. So there are some things about work that we can look to into the 20th century and think, well, there's something worth celebrating. The next slide, please, is one of my favorite. The charabanc of probably the 1930s, 20s, 30s, is Albert Potts is the guy near the front with a fag in his mouth. Is Albert Potts. Yes, thank you. Where they're going, we don't really know, but people from New Mills work as they're ordinary working people. They're on a works outing, a church outing, a cooperative outing, having a bit of a laugh. Now, the next one is one of my favourite photographs. There, 1939, Garrison Works, which is just a bit up towards Birch Vale, 1939 football team from Garrison Works. Workplaces by the 20th century are producing communities. And I put this up there to give Penny something to be inspired about. Can I have the next one, please? Thank you. Now, this I never expected to see. When I came across these photographs, these are science classes. We are in the late 1800s here. This is what was probably what's now the Adult Ed Centre. The worthies of the town brought over and paid John Nichols to come and set up science classes, particularly chemistry classes, for the children of New Mills. And I was learning recently that people are coming from all over to have their chemistry education in New Mills, because the bleaching and the printing industry relied upon modern chemistry. And we know from other records that the lads who studied here with Mr. Nichols could run print works anywhere around the world, and they did. John Nichols actually comes here in the 1880s, and he becomes the first headmaster of New Mills Grammar School, New Mills High School. Reading about him, I found him, a really interesting person. But what impresses me there is you've got men and women, boys and girls, in a chemistry lab. It does remind me of my school days. The last slide, the next slide I've got, is just showing the end of the industry. Just before Strines closes down, there were some photographs were taken of the very, very last generation. Tony and Keith are in one, I don't know which is which, down below. But Bev and Kay, Anne, Kath, Janice are standing there, and they're cloth lookers. They're inspecting the finished product just before it closes down at the end of the century. The next slide is the end, really the end.
Well, excuse me, I'm sorry to interrupt
Go.
you. Could you wind up in the next half a minute or to a minute at the most? Thank you.
That's fine. After more than 200 years of production, Torvale Mill ceased producing in the year 2000, and the following year it was set on fire, probably an arson attack, which I think is very sad, but that's what happened. The next slide, please, takes us, how did we get from here? I started off with these Indian fashions and these Indian delights. And we get to this, which is the last image. The next one, please. This is a Boohoo t-shirt, cost you less than £9, and it was possibly made in one of the sweatshops of Dakar or Leicester. And I hope I've shown you some links between New Mills and the fantastical folly of fashion. We start and we end in Dakar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jill. Fascinating talk. She's part of Manchester Metropolitan University, and she's going to be talking to us about fashion supply chains and sustainability. Over to you, Patsy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My absolute pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. I really like what you're doing with New Mills Fashion Week. So I'm an educator and a researcher. I did my PhD about corporate social responsibility in fashion supply chains, and I did my fieldwork out in Sri Lanka, where the #1 export industry is garment manufacture for predominantly Western brands. So I'm going to talk really about what is a fashion supply chain. I think a lot of people who maybe aren't so knowledgeable about textiles and garments and so on don't really understand the full extent of what a supply chain actually looks like. So hopefully this will shed some light, although I think a lot of what we'll talk about is Jill's already alluded to. I'm just going to hide this, I think, so we can see everything on the slide. So we see quite a lot of information now on various fashion retailers' websites, in corporate reports and so on. There's a lot more sharing about how things are made. And I think, you know, especially this week, which is Fashion Revolution Week, which is a global campaign where citizens, consumers are encouraged to hold brands accountable and ask them, you know, where are my clothes being made? So this talk is going to shed some insight in terms of the complexity of those processes and how things are transformed from raw material into finished garment that we might find in a shop or on a website. So we have various tiers in the supply chain, and nowadays, you know, brands do share a lot more information, but they don't often know the full extent of their supply chain. They only probably work with what we call tier 1, which is the garment manufacturer, where the cut pieces are being sewn together into garments. There's not many brands and retailers that would actually know who's produced the fabric, or even further back from that, who's actually spun that yarn, or even where that fibre was grown or extracted from in the case of polyester. So the processes of transformation are very extensive, and actually the origin of the fashion supply chain is actually in completely different industries, whether that's agriculture, your natural fabrics, or petrochemicals for synthetics. And then, of course, all of this plays out on a huge global scale. So no longer do we have kind of, you know, local manufacture, but since we kind of went to mass production, ready to wear, all of this this process has exploded on a widely dispersed geographical scale, really for the reasons of efficiency. And all of these processes are carried out in different countries by different types of companies. So there is no real end-to-end visibility or transparency. So this is a piece of research that I co-authored last year, where we kind of mapped out what are the environmental impacts of predominantly fast fashion. But we might say now that actually fast fashion has influenced, you know, most of the industry, whether that's the mass market or even the luxury market, in terms of the speed of change and the frequency and, you know, the volume of new collections that are put onto the market with ever increasing frequency. So we can see here that the origin of fashion supply chain is over on the left in agriculture for cotton, for wood, where we get viscose from, and also within petrochemicals for the synthetics. Now, you may find it interesting that actually cotton is no longer the most popular fabric globally for the use of clothing and apparel. It's been overtaken quite some years ago by polyester now, which is the most popular global fibre, for reasons of its performance, its cost efficiency, its versatility, the fact that we can use it for many different applications, whether that's kind of office wear, sports wear, and so on, performance wear. It takes dyes really well, it's very durable, and it's really cheap, which often underpins a lot of the decisions here. But of course, we know that polyester is not biodegradable, and although we may see some retailers using recycled polyester, it doesn't come from recycled garments. So that idea of the closed loop, or recycling garments to be made into new garments, that technology does not exist at all. And if you buy recycled polyester garments, the material will have been made from post-consumer plastic bottles. So there's a famous urban myth that goes around the industry, and that one of the manufacturers out in Taiwan or somewhere that makes recycled polyester yarn, it's mass production, 24/7 process. The factory just never stops. There's not many people in there, so it's all machines, and they ran out of raw material. Now, of course, you don't want to close the factory down or stop the processes, so they had to go and make some more plastic bottles to feed into the machine to recycle it and respin it into new polyester fibre, which kind of goes against everything that we're talking about in terms of reducing single-use plastics. And then we go all the way through the different levels and different types of companies that are involved in making things. And I think we often forget, garments are not just made from textiles, but we have a whole other supply chain of the trims and the embellishments that are needed, such as buttons, zips, sequins, beads, and so on. And there is really no information about where those are made. So if a consumer picks up a garment in a shop, it might have a made in label, but that will just be for where the garment was sewn. It won't be where the buttons or the zips or anything like that has actually come from. And then increasingly we're looking at that sort of end of life process as well. So the fashion supply chain does not stop when a consumer buys something, but there is also a post-consumer phase. And we're now thinking about how can we efficiently collect used unwanted garments and bring them back into a supply chain somehow, to have more of a circular process. So it's a really complex supply chain, and with great geographical dispersion, and I'll talk later about the structure of the different functions. But we might also think now, who controls these supply chains? And over the past few years, we have this idea of what we call a buyer-driven supply chain. So all of the power and the control rests with that end brand or retailer. And we can see here the top 20 players in the fashion market. These companies control over 90% of economic profit in the whole industry. So it really is these big companies that kind of control most of the global supply chains. And as we know, the owners of these businesses are amongst some of the wealthiest people in the world. But we also know that at the bottom of the supply chain, we also have many of the most poorest and most vulnerable workers in the world. So we might say that actually some of the gains of globalization, in that it should allow developing countries to engage in global trade and industrialize, develop their economies and so on, but there doesn't seem to be much equality or equity of distribution of the gains across the supply chain. It seems that most of the gains go to the end retailer or brand, and it's not really shared amongst all of the people that take part in that supply chain. And then some of the implications of this power imbalance in terms of all of the power, all of the control, and the lead retailers really dictate the terms of how they operate with other businesses in the supply chain, and that leads to some of these these negative buying practices that we might see. So we have this idea now of manufacturers without factories. So the brands on the previous slide, none of those will own any type of production or manufacturing facility. So all of that has become outsourced over time, because it is more efficient for those manufacturing and production activities to be carried out by other types of companies, and most often in developing or emerging economies. And therefore the brand just focuses on marketing, design, distribution, the retail experience, the website and so on, the promotion of fashion, but it doesn't actually get involved in making any of the products that it sells. And this is the case across the industry. There's very few, we might say, oh, Zara has its own factories. Well, even Zara extensively uses subcontractors in Asia, so it's not all made in its own factories in Spain. And I think this leads to some of this the complexity, the lack of visibility, and not really knowing where things are made, or who's making them, or even in what conditions. So and then all of this plays out, of course, in developing countries. So we also have cultural issues, the lack of standard regulations, and also different cultural perspectives. What is child labour in the UK from our Western lens? It may not be the fact in a developing country. What age is a child? And sometimes we put our Western lens on what's happening in other countries. As Jill mentioned, many years ago, all children worked. That was just the way it was, and it wasn't considered to be anything particularly bad for them. And all of this has really been exacerbated by the influence of fast fashion. So fast fashion is an extension really of what we might call ready to wear, mass production, and it's got lots of positive aspects as well, in terms of the democratization of new clothing and style and fashion, and really enabling all citizens, all consumers, not only wealthy people, to engage with fashion trends, to try out different looks, and to have the pleasure of wearing brand new clothing rather than hand-me-downs or stuff from a second-hand sale. And we know that fashion makes us feel good. It has lots of positive impacts on our well-being. It's how we communicate, how we identify with other groups, or kind of set ourselves apart from other groups in society. So there's a lot of really positive things about enabling more people to engage with fashion, not only people who have lots of money. But of course we know that this kind of constant low price, low cost manufacture, and ever increasing frequency of new collections, and this kind of cycle of constant novelty, it does have a lot of not only negative impacts on the environment, but also increasingly on people's well-being, especially when all of this is played out on social media, on somebody's phone. There's no real escaping from it, is there? So the original fast fashion retailers, the likes of Zara, H&M, have been around for many decades now. They almost seem a little bit old-fashioned compared to the operations of this new breed of ultra-fast fashion retailers that only operate online, that don't have stores. And it's important to note that they're not just Western ones, but we also have ultra-fast online fashion emerging from the Far East. For example, Shine. I don't know whether you've heard of, but they're doing a big promotional campaign in the UK now. I've had leaflets through my door that I can see advertising on buses and billboards locally. So they're making a big push to come into the UK marketplace too. And the other point is that really fashion consumption is no longer production happens in developing countries for consumption in richer countries, but really consumption happens everywhere now. We've got emerging economies in hugely populated countries such as China and India and so on, where a lot of consumption is happening, and a lot of economic development enables people to move into the middle class. And once a consumer moves into the middle class, that's really quite significant, because it means they've got disposable income to spend on things that aren't necessities such as food and shelter. So they get a taste for perhaps Western style clothing and so on. And then we have the factor of population growth, and there's not much you can do really to stop population growth. So we can start to see that there's some massive systemic factors that we can't really do anything about through consumer behaviour, changing our own practices and habits. And of course, the environmental impact of the clothing is multiplied by the fact that it's not used for very long at all before it's discarded or disposed of. And then, of course, we have this growing problem of textile waste, as we have quicker than ever throughput of garments. But really nothing's changed, has it? So, in the olden days, we used child labour because it was cheaper. Nowadays, we use, outsourcing of production to lower cost labour countries in developing countries where we can, pay people less. Garment manufacture is really labour intensive. So although we have, robotics and automation in other manufacturing industries such as automotive and so on, we don't have extensive automation in garment manufacture because it's cheaper to just get it made in a developing country where the wages are low, and I think that's always going to be the case. And of course the industry has a predilection for using a lot of natural resources and not really kind of taking account of the negative impact of the use of those resources. So what we once saw here in new mills is now being played out, out of sight, out of mind, but in other parts of the world. And it really comes down to this intense downward price pressure. So in the fashion market, if we looked at kind of inflation over last several years, we would see that there hasn't really been much inflation for clothing compared to other consumer goods. So you can get a lot more for your money now, can't you? Especially with fast fashion. But we might question, what corners are being cut both socially and environmentally with those very, very cheap prices. And then here, I think the issue around Rana Plaza, as Jill mentioned earlier, the problem was the building. It wasn't, fundamentally the problem of the fashion industry. But what happened was that the workers recognised that there was cracks in the ceiling, and a lot of workers actually came out of the building earlier that day. But then their managers said, you need to go back in and finish the order, because otherwise we won't finish the order on time and we'll have to pay a penalty to the lead retailer. So it was actually some of those power and control implications of these buyer-driven supply chains, and the fact that the managers were terrified that they wouldn't meet the deadline for the order to be shipped, that they forced the workers to go back into the factory. And equally, the workers were fearful for their jobs, rather than thinking about saving their own lives. They didn't want to lose their jobs, so everybody went back into the building, and then the collapse happened. If the collapse had happened a little bit earlier in the day, there might not have been so many people in the building. So we can see that it is this immense downward price pressure, and also pressure for speed, for quicker delivery, to reach the market when the trend is happening. And of course, these trends are ever faster before they start and finish. But ultimately, the harm of these negative buying practices, it all happens and comes down to the workers. So they're kind of facing the brunt impact of some of these commercial buying practices around speeding things up and making things cheaper, and eventually something's got to give. So we see this in this persistent violation of workers' rights, in terms of some of the working conditions that people have to work in to make the clothing for us, the fact that companies seem to be chasing cheap labour around the globe, and trying to find the next developing country where the wages are a little bit cheaper, or where regulation is more lax, you know, whether that's environmental regulation around pollution, or whether it's social responsibility. You know, a lot of these developing countries, they don't have, you know, the kind of laws and systems that we have here, like the idea of a trade union in some countries is actually illegal, and workers have been, you know, murdered for trying to set up a trade union, or some kind of representation in the workplace. So, you know, how does that play out with all of these wonderful, you know, sustainability and social responsibility statements that brands often put on their websites and sometimes on the labels, when they're actually manufacturing in countries where workers are not allowed to, you know, organise together. And then, of course, when COVID hit, so the world became much more aware of some of these commercial buying practices and how they actually impact on workers. So we know that once lockdown hit, and some retailers that didn't have great online presence, they knew they weren't going to be able to sell all that stock that they'd ordered several months in advance. So they tried to wriggle out of their financial commitments and save a bit of money. And bearing in mind that many of these retailers are owned by some of the richest people in the world, but they did whatever they could not to pay for the orders that the manufacturers had already made. But we can see, excuse me, the impact of citizen activism, because the Pay Up campaign that you may have seen that kind of went all over social media has actually been very successful, in that most of these brands have actually backtracked and have paid up because of the negative press that they've been experiencing. But certainly this didn't just happen in Bangladesh, but we also saw, you know, workers here in Leicester being encouraged to go to work despite government mandates of staying at home, because of this huge surge in online shopping demand. And then there is a very sad story in one of the reputable Bangladeshi newspapers, where there's a story of a couple who sold their baby because they couldn't afford to pay the hospital bill. In the end, the police found the baby and returned it back to the couple. But it just kind of underpins this very precarious nature of work for many garment workers still in the world, despite these, you know, these wonderful ideas of global trade and global supply chains and so on. It doesn't seem like situations is much better than a couple of 100 years ago. So yeah, so post-COVID then, so there's been a lot of talk about, you know, for companies, we've had a bit of a fallout of, you know, some retailers won't survive that were, you know, facing problems anyway. Consumers have had opportunity and time to reflect on their consumption, and many consumers are indicating that they're going to come out of this a little bit more consciously in terms of what they're buying and how they're using fashion. And there's talk about, you know, building back better, and the need for a smaller and more sustainable fashion industry once we emerge out of lockdown. So do we think perhaps whether this will provide an opportunity to fundamentally overhaul the system? Because we've seen the worst of it, really, haven't we, with the pandemic? And also, what can we as consumers do to support this? I think there's much greater awareness now in terms of, you know, some of the negative impacts of these global supply chains and the exploitation of workers. Despite the fact that Rana Plaza happened 8 years ago, you know, some of the manufacturers in Bangladesh are saying, well, actually nothing much has changed over those 8 years, and they're still, you know, facing massive difficulties with these quite, you know, exploitative commercial practices of the world's biggest retailers. So I'm going to finish there, and we can maybe have some discussion, or I feel perhaps that I'm preaching to the converted, because I'm sure you all know, you know, what we need to do as consumers. But, you know, as consumers, we can't always effectively effect systematic change that is needed of the scale to really solve some of these problems. Thank you.
Patsy, thank you so much. That was so interesting, and of course sometimes quite shocking. Okay. We've got